Welcome. Please take a seat. We'd like to start on time. Woo! So welcome to Jubilee 2023. Woo! It's so great to see you here back in person. I'm Maya Tripp. I'm the Jewish Life and Culture Director at Jewish Silicon Valley.
And I'm Rabbi Husaid Valencia. I'm the Senior Director of Collaborative Leadership and Jewish Engagement at Jewish Silicon Valley. Great to see you all.
So we'd like to start by thanking our sponsors and our partners. You can see the full list on our webpage. And to so many of you who contributed to this event's success by volunteering and by donating. Thank you so much. That's my turn to clap. So this day is all about multicultural Judaism. It is about doing things Jewishly in other cultures and places. And we want you to come out of this day acknowledging the array of traditions, behaviors, and customs we all have, and how we accept all of them and how your roots are respected. One day of getting into the spirit is taking a look around you at the one-day exhibit our dear community members have put together called Identities. And I want you to maybe practice thinking what would be your object that represents your Jewish identity and journey. This exhibit will be here until we gather again at 5:30 with some Jewish foods from around the world. Between now and then, we will have 3 breakout sessions. Really, the lineup is amazing, full of amazing presenters and workshops and panels and classes, and some amazing opportunities to meet new and old friends and maybe keep the conversation going and the relationship going.
So our mission at Jewish Silicon Valley is to harness the power of community, to improve lives, build bridges of understanding, and strengthen the Jewish people. And we envision a vibrant Jewish community in Silicon Valley. In order to realize that vision of a vibrant Jewish community in Silicon Valley, I believe we ought to be lifting up our differences, what makes us unique, what makes us distinct, as well as celebrating what brings us together, our unity. And so I'm really excited to be celebrating our distinctiveness, our cultural diversity here with you today. I'd also like to say that our program today is dependent on the donations of volunteers and community members throughout our community all year long. If you'd like, and we're deeply grateful for that generosity of spirit that people bring to their engagement with our community. We're really hoping that you bring that same sense of full investment in exploration, in celebrating your own distinctiveness and connections to Jewish community today. And if you'd like to join in that effort to donate and support the community, there's a QR code in your schedule for today. So feel free to use that QR code to make a donation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Yu. And you will be able to meet Rabbi Yu twice today, right? Yeah, in a writing workshop and also in a panel. And now to our keynote speaker. We are so happy to have Haan here with us, the professor of Jewish studies at the University of San Francisco, where he also directs the SWIG program in Jewish studies and social justice, the only academic program in the world formally linking these 2 fields. He is the author of Judaisms, a 21st century introduction to Jews and Jewish identities, a book that is on sale now, and you can have Haan autograph at the end. We will have a presentation and then some Q&A, and try to keep everything in less than an hour. So good luck and welcome, Haan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks. Hi. My name is Aaron. I am a East Coast transplant. I moved out here about 15, 16 years ago, and my kids, well, one of them is still at Yavne Day School next door, and one of the other ones, he started here in pre-K and graduated last year. I share all of that a little bit because I grew up in Philadelphia going to Jewish day schools for 13 years. And went to 10 summers at overnight camp, Jewish overnight camp, and studied in seminaries, yeshivot, and eventually married a rabbi. She was the rabbi of Yavne for 14 years, and now she's the rabbi at Stanford. So in certain respects, you could say I'm very Jewy, right? That I have lived my life as a Jew. I have studied what it is to be a Jew, what other people think it means to be a Jew, and through that process, landed a job at the University of San Francisco, which is a very outspokenly non-Jewish university, right? It's a Jesuit Catholic school. So when I first started at USF, I was slated to teach the Intro to Judaism course, and I never taught a 16-week course about Judaism. I taught shorter sessions. I taught a little bit at some other universities, but hadn't taught an Intro to Judaism course. And through that process, where most of my students were not Jewish and still are not Jewish, maybe 10% of our school is Jewish, through that process, I came to learn much more about Judaism because I had to, right? I had to be the expert in the room who was teaching all these people, and this was probably their one-off chance of learning about what it means to be a Jew. And none of the books that are out there at the time, none of the Intro to Judaism books really worked for my students. We, at USF, were one of the two most racially and ethnically diverse campuses in the country last year and this year. 1/3 of our students are the first in their families to get a university degree. So there were a lot of pluralities, people coming from all different backgrounds, and I needed to figure out how to teach and learn from these students, and through that process I ended up writing a book called Judaisms, a 21st century introduction to Jews and Jewish identities. So what I want to do in the next 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have about a 15-minute Q&A, is kind of give you a snapshot of the book. And I have, oh, we need the password. Of course. You might want to kill one or two of the lights up here to make it easier to see. Okay. So part of the question here is, what do any of us, either in the room or beyond the room, what do we think of when we hear the word Jew? Right? Just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you have any more of an accurate understanding of what it means to be a Jew than a non-Jew, frankly, right? In certain ways, you might even have a more narrow understanding of what it means to be a Jew. All right, so there's two main takeaways, and you don't have to look at this. I'm going to say the same things that are on the main one is that there's never been one monolithic, homogeneous understanding of what it means to be a Jew. Even if you trace the timeline of Jews back to the Israelites and back to the Hebrews, right? That's the common way that we talk about Jews. Even if you did that and start the nation of the Jews, even though the word Jew doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, it says that the free slaves or the formerly enslaved Hebrews who are now fleeing Pharaoh and his soldiers, it calls them the mixed multitudes. Literally from the get-go, there's never been a homogeneous group. They've always, they, us, whoever you are, I don't know how you identify, but Jews have always been heterogeneous, always. That's one takeaway. The other takeaway is even though they've never been monolithic, we talk about them, non-Jews and Jews commonly talk about them as if when we say Jews, we all know what we're talking about, right? That the signifier Jew, that when you say Jew and I say Jew, we mean the same exact thing. And chances are, the number of people in this room, that's how many different definitions we would have for what it means to be a Jew. And you can multiply that by quite a few other people outside the room. So those are the main two takeaways. To some degree, I would say this paradoxical statement encapsulates really what we're talking about, right? No one has been able to define Jew, and in essence, this defiance of definition is the central meaning of Jewish consciousness. What that means, I have no idea, right? But that's part of it, perhaps, right? For what it's worth, Carl Shapiro was a Pulitzer Prize winner and a U.S. Poet Laureate, so we can, oh, okay, so we'll take his opinion. All right, so part of the issue here is when we think and talk about Jews, why is it that many of us have this stereotype, even those in the Jewish community? And part of the problem is that stereotype is simply a representation. And often it becomes a skewed representation and not necessarily even an accurate representation, right? Stereotypes are a fantasy, a projection onto the other that makes them less threatening. Stereotypes abound when there is distance. Of course, sometimes they're more threatening too, but. All right, so there is a dominant Jewish story, right? We talk about the Jews. If you go to synagogue, no doubt, the rabbi is talking about the Jews in the Hebrew Bible. And as I mentioned, there are no Jews in the Hebrew Bible. Maybe it's the same group. Most of us, that's how we accept it, okay? But there's no group that calls itself Jews. We're not even positive where the word Jew comes from. I'm not a historian. I'm not an ancient historian or a modern historian, but I read a lot of books. And the best scholars who have studied this stuff, and I can give you lots of citations, we don't know when Israelites became Judeans, became Jew. That's the theory, but we're not even sure. So that's to say that we talk about this arc of the Jewish people as if it's a connected line, but that's not how history is, right? History is much messier. So these are the dominant Jewish identities. When we talk about Jews, many of us are actually talking about Ashkenazi Jews. When we say the Jews, many of us are actually thinking Ashkenazi Jews, right? Those Jews whose ancestry goes back to Europe, Eastern Europe, White Russia, Poland, Latvia, Riga. Commonly, many of us are thinking of males. American or Israeli, heterosexual, cisgender, right, was when the gender identity or the sex that is assigned at birth matches how the person identifies later on in life, i.e. not transgender. Middle class or upper class, Jews as a religion. These are the dominant tropes. And I basically want to look at each one of these relatively quickly and blow it up. All right, so for many people, looking around the room, probably many of us in this room, because I can tell you 18 to 22-year-olds have no idea who that is, which is interesting, right? So then there's generational, what is a Jew? All right, yes, there's been a lot of controversy with this person. I've watched the documentaries. But quintessentially, at least up to a certain point in our lives here, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, certainly in the 80s and 90s, this was, quote unquote, a quintessential Jew. Now, what's interesting to me is that this picture from the famed Annie Hall, when he goes home with Annie Hall, I think it's at Thanksgiving, Annie Hall not Jewish, so now he's at a table, this character is at a table, and he's looking at Annie Hall's grandmother, And this is what he thinks Annie Hall's grandmother sees when she's looking at him, right? It's interesting that that's what he chose. Like, that's the depiction, because that's what a real Jew looks like, as opposed to, you know, that itself, right? There's a scholar at Stanford, Shana Hammerman, who has written about this and talked quite a bit about this. And why is it that that is the quintessential looking Jew? It's a fair question. Sammy Davis, another person, 18 to 22-year-olds have no idea who that is, right? Fortunately, they kind of have an idea who that is, right? Him too, Homeland and some other shows recently. Lenny Kravitz, also Jewish, right? All of these people identify as Jews. I'm not saying they're Jews. It's not me giving them those names. They're calling it, right? Leonard Nimoy, but also Captain Kirk to some of us, right? Shatner. Gershom Suzomu, who's certainly made the rounds in the Bay Area and Southern California, the chief rabbi of Uganda. Many of you are familiar with her, right? Maya Rudolph from SNL. This is actually a pretty quick sketch of what Jews look like, Jewish Americans, all right? This individual used to go by the name Yisrael Katz and transitioned about 10, 15 years ago. Abby Stein has a well-known book out. Right now, if I showed you Abby Stein's picture, you might not know one way or the other that Abby is Jewish. But if I showed you that picture, you might think, yeah, Jewish. So why do we think that is part of the question. All right, let's dig a little deeper here. Well, this isn't really deeper, but you know, we got The Simpsons, pop culture. Pop culture is part of this reinforcement of what a stereotypical Jew looks like. So that's Krusty the Clown's father, right? You have Curb Your Enthusiasm, rather, right? You have the Family Guy with the payas there. You have a Passover Seder that took place every year under the Obama administration, right? But they're using, by and large, Ashkenazi rituals. Passover Seders are one of the most really like breath-wise different types of rituals you can have in a very important Jewish holiday. But it was very Ashkenazi-centric. All right, and here's a very, very quick video, 1 minute, just to make a point. Oh, and there it was. All right. Count how many times the players wearing white passed the basketball. Probably some of you are familiar with this. How many passes did you count? 15, all right? But did you see the gorilla? Okay. So many people are now familiar with this experiment, and if you see the gorilla, you have no idea how someone didn't see it, right? And if you didn't see it before and now you're seeing it, you have no idea how you didn't see it. It's a selective attention test by these two social psychologists. They call it inattentional blindness. Now, they did this study with thousands of different people, called the invisible gorilla, right? I couldn't tell you that ahead of time. They have found that regardless of identities, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of all sorts of things, 50% of people see the gorilla and 50% don't, which is really fascinating. And they've done all sorts of other experiments along these lines. But the point is that sometimes we don't see things that are right in front of us. Many of us know this, and many of us were introduced to this, and we realize our blind spots, but all of us have blind spots. They call it inattentional blindness, That's one way we could call it. But part of the idea is, why do we hold up certain portrayals or representations of Jews as the representation when that's actually just a representation? And part of it is because we don't necessarily see what's right in front of us. Now, there's this famous, amazing photographer named Frederick Brenner. He went around the world for 20 years and took pictures of Jews. His project is called Diaspora. It's a really amazing, incredibly expensive book that probably a lot of libraries have. And his takeaway is that Jews look like everyone, meaning there is no way that Jews look. He literally went around the world. It's a magnificent project. And part of this idea here is that he uses the term that Jews have a portable identity and that they have cross-fertilized over the course of history with Jews and non-Jews, culturally, physically, all of the above. And that's why Jews look like everyone. So one idea here is that Jews, certainly Jews, statistically speaking, Jews over 60 in America, but also non-Jews, most Jews of a certain era think of Jews and Judaism as a religion, right? But we know from data over the last 20 plus years here in the United States that most Jews under the age of 40 think of Judaism as a culture or a heritage or an ethnicity. And many of Jews under 35 say that they have no religion, and then their Judaism is not a religion. They're even explicit that it's not a religion. So there's all sorts of reasons why we might have that Judaism as a religion, as a common dominant narrative or a stereotype. But more to the point, culture, ethnicity, nationality, race, religion, those are the swath of different ways that Jews claim their Judaism today. And that's a major shift. In terms of middle class or upper class, the stereotype is that Jews are middle class or upper class, but the facts on the ground, especially in the United States of America, poverty exists in the American Jewish community to the same degree as other communities. In New York City, for instance, where 1.8 million Jews reside, 1/3 of Jews live in poverty or near poverty, 20% of them children, right? And more Jews live in New York City than any other American city, second most Jewishly populated city in the world next to Tel Aviv, Israel. Another stereotype, Jews are heterosexual, cisgender, but over the last 20 plus years, it's become much more talked about, certainly in Northern California more than other places in the Jewish community, but many Jews identify as queer, many Jews identify as gay or lesbian or transgender or gender nonconforming or intersex, and on and on. And starting in 2000, really, you started to see Jewish organizations, in America in particular, that are holding up the mantle for Jews who identify as queer and offer projects and programs along those lines. This is an image from an organization called Keshet, probably the most well-known LGBTQIA plus Jewish American organization. Here's a picture of a quote-unquote, it looks like a quote-unquote normal picture, right? This is a gender transition ceremony at a Jewish day school in the East Bay just a few years ago. I think it was 2015. And you wouldn't have seen such a thing even 10 years ago, right? Like that was the first photos that went viral around the world of a gender transition ceremony in a Jewish day school. Tom Sosnick. In terms of American or Israeli, well, Jews actually, even to this day, if there's roughly 200 countries in the world, depends how you define a country, 140 of them, Jews currently reside on. And prior to the 20th century, right, that's when there's been this really cataclysmic shift in Jews moving to two places, the State of Israel and United States of America. But prior to that, that notion of the Jewish diaspora and Jews existing on 140 out of 200 countries or even more, that was really the norm. It's not the norm now, but that's more of the norm of the last couple thousand years than it is now. Male-centric, right? The patriarchy is a whole thing that also exists, like heteronormativity and cisgenderness exists well beyond the Jewish community, no doubt. You do have this idea that Jewish women are in positions of authority, different than they have been for, if you look at a timeline, right? In the Reform movement, you started to ordain female rabbis in the 70s, the first one, of course, being Regina Jonas, who was murdered in the Holocaust, 1936, she was ordained. But after Regina Jonas, not until the 70s, you start having women ordained. In the 80s, and Reform movement and Reconstructionist movement in the 70s, the conservative movement in the 80s. So you do have Jewish women in positions of authority as never before, right? These are the first Sally Priesand in the Reform movement. This woman was the first ordained rabbah. You have a fringe in terms of numbers, modern Orthodox communities where they're starting to ordain women as rabbis. This was the first one, but she went by the name title rabbah. And yet, of course, even though women are in positions of authority as never before in the Jewish community, this is an infographic from just a couple years ago in the Association of Jewish Studies magazine. Talks about the patriarchy, basically. Male-dominate professional leadership in terms of salaries, etc., opinion making, and on and on. So I'm not saying that these stereotypes, we can blow them up entirely, but this is one of the reasons why Judaism is still very male-centric. These are not the reasons, these are the data to point to that fact, rather. All right, in terms of Ashkenazi-ness, right, Jews come in so many different stripes and colors, more than any other community that I've ever studied. So keep this point in mind of that over the last century plus, Jews have moved to 2 countries. 80% of all Jews live in 2 countries. But the norm actually is Jews residing on 140 of the 200 countries in the world. And this is much more reflective of reality, right? That we have Chinese Jews. This is a family, Jin Guangsang, in Kaifeng, China, a photo from about a decade ago. But you can go back 100 years and also see pictures of Chinese Jews. If we pivot towards India, you have B'nai Menashe, Indian Jews. You have B'nai Israel, Jews. This is a picture from the JCC in Mumbai a few years ago. You have Jews that call themselves Baghdadi Jews there. If we shift towards Yemen, you have, this is over 100 years ago. We might call them black, right? But blackness is a whole other conversation. Right, and there's all sorts of photos like this in one of the many important displays, exhibits here today. Habani Jews from Yemen, and Morocco, for instance. Now, so Morocco's really interesting to me, and among other reasons, because I got to spend a summer there quite a while back now, but in 1999. And in Morocco, you have, if someone told you they were a Moroccan Jew, that wouldn't necessarily tell you that much. And what I mean by that is Moroccan Jews, some trace themselves back 2,500 years. They say they ended up there due to the Babylonian exile. Some, their familial tradition is that they ended up there about 2,000 years ago, destruction of the Second Temple. Some ended up there during the Arab conquest of the Muslim Arab conquest of North Africa and traveled with Muslims during that time and would identify as Arab. Some arrived there during the multiple inquisitions, Spain, Portugal, right, when Jews were kicked out of these regions, which happened over the course of hundreds of years, not just in 1492 and 1495. Some Moroccan Jews ended up there fleeing pogroms in Russia. Some ended up there during French occupation, and on and on and on. And these two cities, interestingly, which are actually Spanish-controlled, they're parts of Spain, Ceuta and Melilla, mostly make the news these days due to African immigrants trying to make their way towards Europe. But a few years back, in 2012, there was an article I came across of the different synagogues in Melilla, and there were 12 different synagogues of different types of Jews, right? So what I want you to think when you think of Moroccan Jews is actually what you should think, or what all of us should think when we think of Indian Jews or Yemenite Jews or Chinese Jews or Ethiopian Jews or any of it. For me, my brain works visually. If you opened up the door, suppose that's the door to the Moroccan Jewish room, and you open up that door, you're in a room and there's 20 more doors. That's what I think of when I think of, oh, Yemenite Jews, right? Except it's this door over here. That there's so many subtypes of Jews within each of these places that even though we homogenize and think, and we can do the same thing with Ashkenazi Jews. I'll do that very quickly in a moment. But when we think of these archetypes, even of non-Ashkenazi groups, we still box them in and reduce them. We think they're one type. If you study Ugandan Jews, which is by and large a recent Jewish community, the leader of their community converted about 100 plus years ago, there's also quite a few different types of Ugandan Jews. So for every group of Jews, you open up this door to this room and there's 20 other doors. And you go into one of those doors and there's 20 more doors. And that's really what the Jewish community is like. All right, now I'm going to cut short in a couple minutes, but I want to give a couple reasons for some of this Ashkenazi dominance. One is that migration, right? Specifically between 1880 and 1920, you had roughly 2 million Jews coming to the United States. But you have the major shift. There's reasons for these stereotypes, is part of my point. Why is American-centric and Israeli-centric, those are the two archetypes above all else? Well, 80% of all Jews live in those two countries. 40% of all Jews live in the United States of America, 40% live in the state of Israel. But if we go back 100 plus years, that wasn't the case, right? Or really 140 years for the United States of America. It's recent. For all of our lives, it's been the norm. But if we pan back and look at Jewish history over a couple thousand years, maybe even 3,000 years, it's a blip. Or the state of Israel, right? If we go back to pre-state, when it was the land of Israel, even 100 years ago, you had small numbers of Jews. But once the state of Israel was founded and immigration increased, right, it's really gone up like this, and if we had a graph. So I understand why the Jewish community is American-centric and Israeli-centric, for instance, but that doesn't mean that it should be, right, given the diversity of our community. I'll skip through this. All right, some of that I already said. Most Jews in the world today, 60% or so, identify as Ashkenazi. But if you go back 500 years, 800 years, 1,000 years, the estimates are much smaller, right? I'll look at another piece of this is that in much more in the United States than the state of Israel, the Ashkenazi community has become homogenized, right? In 1849, Jews who were living in San Francisco decided to start a synagogue. Looking backwards, we might call them, using today's words, Polish community and the German community, right? That's not what they would have called themselves. And they came together to start a synagogue, and within a very short period of time, figured out that they couldn't start the same synagogue and started two synagogues, right? One is Temple Emmanuel, that's where the German Jews went. One is Shereth Israel, right? These aren't their original buildings, but that's all to say that even from, right, 150, 170 years ago, if you were a Yiddish-speaking Jew, and I'll make it more personal, my wife's father is of German descent, and the Germans who spoke German, right, who looked down on the Germans who spoke Yiddish, my stock are Yiddish speakers. Chances are 170 years ago I wouldn't have been able to marry my wife, right? Because that was cacophonous, that was discord. Over the last 170 years, to some degree, those differences are not important, right? Some people take pride in their heritage much more than others in terms of being Ashkenazi, but by and large, if a German Jewish, person of German Jewish descent was in America, was marrying a person of Polish Jewish descent, the parents would probably, especially in Northern California, just be happy that a Jew was marrying a Jew, right? But that wasn't the case for much of American history. So another reason for Ashkenazi dominance is because in America, the Ashkenazi community has become much more homogenized. And there's all sorts of other reasons, but I'm going to skip all of this and cut to the chase. There's a famous story by Isaac Bashevis Singer, who he tells this tale of this person who went to, he was traveling, and he saw one Jew, a socialist in Warsaw, and then the afternoon he met this religious Jew in another city, and da-da-da-da, and basically he comes and tells this story to Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Isaac Bashevis Singer is like, what's the big deal? There's different types of Jews out there. And the guy's like, don't you understand? It's actually all the same Jew, right? It's the same person. It's better if I have the quote. But the point is that think about any one of you, any one of us, and what Judaism means to you today. What did it mean to you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago? Most of us, I would submit, have had different relationships with our Jewish identities over our lifetime. And if we think of ourselves and ourselves as, look at how much differences we have within ourselves vis-a-vis Jews, well, if there's 15 million Jews, think of it like that. And that's really what we're talking about when we get to the plurality of the Jewish community. There has always been and always will be multiple understandings of Jews. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have some time for some questions and answers with Aaron Haan Tapper. So if anyone has a question you'd like to ask, raise your hand and I will bring the mic to you. Anyone? Okay, comment?
Are you aware of the Karaite community in Daly City?
Yes, very, very much so.
Could you explain to the people who the Karaites are?
You know, I wish I had planted that one because this is wonderful. So I work with some colleagues at University of San Francisco, and we recently started a new website. It's called Mapping Jewish San Francisco. And this is based on a project down in LA and a few other Jewish studies departments around the country. We're not the first to come up with this. And our first exhibit was on the House of Love and Prayer, a kind of a hippie synagogue in Haight-Ashbury that was founded in 1969. And the second project, which we launched and put online 2 months ago, is called Out of Egypt. And it's the most extensive multimedia research on the Karaite community of the San Francisco Bay Area, where we have not only put a bunch of their texts up online, we have at the moment tens of videos, short 2-3 minute spots of what it was like to be a Jew living in Cairo in 1950 or 1967 or what have you. The short answer is that most Jews, so Karaites call non-Karaite Jews rabbinites. All right, so we'll just say I'm a Rabbinite Jew for now. Most Rabbinite Jews don't even know who the Karaite Jews are. Karaite Jews, what I was taught in my Jewish day school, somewhere along the line where Karaites didn't follow the oral tradition that I was taught. More or less, that's what Karaite Jews would say. They would say that the authority of the Talmud is not nearly as definitive as it should be, and that there's all sorts of other opinions out there. And it's a really fascinating group of Jews, and their only synagogue in the entire western hemisphere of the planet Earth happens to be in Daly City, right outside San Francisco. And most of their community lived in Egypt until the last half century, and for a variety of interesting reasons, they ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And like I said, they were interviewed, about 30 members of their community were interviewed in depth about 10 years ago. And thankfully, I'm friends with quite a few people in the Karaite community, and they lent me their interview archives, and I went through them over the course of 5 years with students and broke them down into 6 or 7 themes, and within each one we have snippets that are on our YouTube channel talking about their experiences as Jews and what it was like to come to the United States of America and what have you. But the Karaites are a wonderful Jewish community.
Aaron, thank you. Wonderful presentation. So I have an identity question. And it's actually about the phrase or the word non-Jew. So I'm comfortable using the adjective non-Jewish. But, you know, of all the people I know who are not Jewish, I don't know of any of them who self-describe as non-Jew. Hi, I'm a non-Jew. So I'm wondering if you could address that for us and about how we might think about that and move beyond that phrase.
Good, thank you. So to answer that, I'd even take a step back. Any term that we have is problematic. Any term, right? The term queer is a term, by and large, not used by much of the country. People who identify as LGBTQIA and somewhere in that umbrella do not like the term queer. That term is normative in the San Francisco Bay Area. When I was writing Judaisms, I wrote an email to 30 different people of prominent queer communities around the country and to get their take. And by and large, people on the East Coast still don't use that term. And certainly people of my mom's era think of it as a slur. So that's all to say, every term is problematic. For me, the term Gentile might make me uncomfortable, and I'm not saying you're uncomfortable, but the term non-Jew, to many people's ear, might be a negative, and I certainly do not intend it like that. Non-Jewish person is probably better suited, and I appreciate that. And part of that is just a conversation of, like, if we had a conversation, if you and I were at a symposium and we come to terms on, well, what terms are we going to be using this evening, right? It's difficult in a room full of people you don't know, but I hear that, and it's not dissimilar to terms like slave versus enslaved person, or prisoner versus an incarcerated person, and making it more of an adjective. So I appreciate that.
Questions? Other questions?
Could you speak a little bit about the new Jews of North Africa, all in a number of different countries there? Did they come after the Roman invasion or later? And did they communicate with each other to form a more unified feeling of being Jews, or were they isolated?
So if you're talking about just various Jewish communities in Northern Africa, well, historically, we have documents of sometimes communities writing letters to one another. And certainly we have more artifacts from 500 years ago than 1,000, and more from 300 years ago than 500. But by and large, a lot of these communities did live in isolation. It depends geographically. So I'll give you an example. In Morocco, there's a, and it's also a contested term. Some people use the term Berbers, indigenous Moroccans. So there's Berber Jews up in the Atlas Mountains, and they actually didn't have much correspondence with the Jews in Casablanca and the Jews in Rabat and the Jews in some of the other cities that were not in the mountains. So you can extrapolate that if they barely had interaction with Casablancan Jews, then they weren't having much interaction with Jews in Algeria and Libya and Iraq and Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. But we also know that some of these communities, we have documents, so there was, at the same time there was a temple in Jerusalem, there were also about 4 other temples. People didn't necessarily call the temple in Jerusalem the temple. So there's a temple, for instance, in the south of Egypt. Elephantine is the site. And we have documents of the Elephantinian Jews, specifically the priests of that temple, writing documents to the priest in the temple in Jerusalem. So there's all sorts, it really depends on the community of how they ended up there. And we do have some interactions over the course of time and place. I don't know. It would depend on the community. It's an interesting question. What I'm hearing your question, and you might not be saying this, is another kind of a meta question, which might be, well, what connects the Jew in Algiers with the Jew in Krakow, with the Jew in Johannesburg, with the Jew in Melbourne, Australia? And that's, I would say, the question, right? What connects, if you have such diversity and such multiculturalism, then what's the common thread? Well, you got to come back next week for that one.
You spoke greatly about the Ashkenazi community. My background is all Sephardic. I believe all the way back to Portugal, although I can trace my family back to London, coming from Amsterdam. And until my father married my mother, it was totally Sephardic. My mother was Ashkenazi. But you don't even discuss this Sephardic. I'm curious about it.
Yeah, that was lack of time. So in the Judaisms book, I talk about it quite a bit. Sephardic is a whole other, so the term Sephardi, which commonly people, they trace their lineage back to Spain and Portugal, right? And many times having gotten kicked out of there in the 1400s. So even the term Sephardic is fascinating because it didn't start to be used until the 1500s. Right? So it's used retroactively. Sephardic Jews, the original Sephardic Jews didn't even call themselves Sephardic, right? So, but if somebody tells you they're a Sephardic Jew, if we looked at a map right now and looked at, say, the Mediterranean Sea, like just because they're a Sephardic Jew, that's also, likewise, doesn't tell you much, because you could be a Sephardic Jew that went north and ended up in the Netherlands. You could be a Sephardic Jew that went to Morocco. You could be a Sephardic Jew that went east. And interestingly, in Morocco, for instance, you had Sephardic Jews coming in the 1100s and 1200s and 1300s and 1400s and 1500s, right? When we look back, we just glom all those people together. But obviously, we can think in terms of just our Bay Area living here, when Jews came in the 90s versus Jews coming in the 50s versus Jews coming in the 20s, right? Those are radically different time periods, and whatever Jews were here would think of those others as others until they're no longer others, which is to say that when it comes to Sephardic Jews, just the waves coming to Morocco, one after the other, and some were living in secret, right, which is a whole other element of Sephardi Jews. So I certainly didn't mean to minimize. I was spending, I'm an academic who just got caught in my own wheels. But the book does not focus on Ashkenazi Jews. It focuses on the plurality of Jews, and if anything, there's a dearth of information in there on Ashkenazi Jews.
All right, we've got time for one final question.
So thank you, Aaron. I know you don't have your crystal ball with you, but if you did, I'm looking around the room. We're a graying room. What does your crystal ball say American Jewish life will look like in the next 25 years or 50 years?
So I'm smart enough to say I have absolutely no idea. I don't know. You know, if I had more time with you all, and that question came up after talking, I would probably say something along the lines of this, because usually what people ask is, so who do you accept as a Jew? Right? Which is part of the answer to that question, I think. So, you know, what I say is, well, right now my daughter's 12 and my son is 14 or 15. So I guess the rubber meets the road when one of them comes home with somebody that they're dating or they want to marry, and then I guess then my intellectual conversations about how everyone can kind of be a Jew then bump up against my personal biases. But the reason that answers the question is because part of this still goes back to the beginning of how do we define what a Jew is. And in the East Coast, my experience is born in 1973, and I was basically there through 1991. I went to college out there. At least back then, I can speak definitively, the East Coast was much narrower in their understanding of what a Jew is. Much more narrow than out here in California. And I would argue that the way for the Jewish people to keep going is to keep that tent big. Right? I had a student in my office who came to my office because I'm the Jewish studies professor on campus who runs the Jewish studies program. Dad, Ashkenazi Jew, mom, Cambodian, non-Jewish woman. And we were just talking, right? There might have been a time in my life that I would have thought more about, oh, well, is he really a Jew? It's through his dad's side, not his mom's side, right? All those types of questions that I'm not saying are unimportant. My mom converted to Judaism, so I'm well versed in the conversion notion and whether or not that gives you authenticity or not as a Jew. But I don't think that's for me to decide, and if he's telling me what his identity is, I think that's what we need to embrace. He's coming to meet with me. I didn't seek him out. So he's interested in exploring that part of his identity. He's a 20-year-old. So I think what we as a community of Jewish and non-Jewish people who identify with the Jewish community, right? We know that from data the Federation has put together. That's a fair number of non-Jewish people who identify with Jews, that I would say that we need to have a big tent Judaism and big tent approach. And if we do that, then it's an interesting conversation of what's going to be in 25 years. But if we don't do that, I worry.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I know we could continue this conversation all day. You have so much interesting insight, but in the interest of time, I want to get everyone, but there's so many amazing speakers here today that we want to allow time for, so a big thank you to Aaron Haan and all of you.
And thank you very much to Jewish Silicon Valley for having me, and thank you, Maya, and thank you, Rabbi Hugh, and thank you to this amazing community that I've been part of for 15 years. Thank you.
And again, the book Judaisms is for sale back here, and there's going to be some book signing, so stay tuned for that.